There are a couple ways I think about the master developer approach. One is around need. So if you think of the massive urbanization that's happening around the world as hundreds of millions of people move to cities, it doesn't appear that governments are able to build the cities out fast enough for us to avoid having a giant planet of sprawl. So in terms of need for people who can build these things in a more professional way, I think we need hundreds of these kind of cities. In terms of what they bring, I think there are three aspects. One is capability, one is capacity, and one is capital. So in capability, in terms of who actually knows how to do this, who has a sense for how to make things happen. In terms of capacity, who has the person power, who has the ability to get enough folks who are trained all to push against the project. And finally, capital. Is it possible to raise outside capital in the private sector to fund some of the city projects that we're talking about? I think it's a stretch to say that these have been adopted on a very large scale. There's some hopes to have enterprise-led cities, and several have been announced. It's harder to say there's more than a handful of successful ones. But I think there are two different categories of the challenges and how to address them. One is broad around policy uncertainty. Like, will the environment or the regime where the work is happening have the same policies for the decades it takes to build out a city? Will there be exposure? And the second is around demand questions. So yes, there are a lot of people moving to cities. They aren't moving to every city. So one of the major conceptual challenges for the professional master developers is that the clients aren't necessarily realistic. They might have a fantasy, they might have a hope that if they put a line around something and say there's a tax advantage and build a couple high rises, all of a sudden they'll have Wall Street in the middle of their desert. So those are broader challenges. More specifically, some of the obvious ones are around the way you'd expect anyway: duration, timing, phasing, and the different nature of the investments that are being made. So with respect to duration, these projects are long. So you're talking about decades to have assets at risk and people engaged and wait for a payoff. That's a challenge compared to a quick flip in a trade or a quick flip in an office building or trying to build a .com or something and selling that really quickly. The second is around phasing, deciding what can be built when, and do you try and position the new city in a certain way, or do you build what can be built first to generate cash flow? So that depends on the structure and the location of the first bit that might not be where it wants to be in the final master plan. The third is around the very different needs for cash and investment. So if you think about land acquisition, you need a lot of cash up front. Nothing much happens after that. There's no return. You think about heavy infrastructure like transit or even roads or water. That's also a very high first cost and a very long return. You think about master developer land preparation. That can be a quicker return if the land has demand. Then you think about a real estate developer building apartments for sale, usually when there's a market, much quicker return. So you have these four very different kinds of asset with four very different time frames and four very different kind of repayments. So the challenge is to match those up with the parties who want to do each one in a way that makes sense for them. So the answer to the same question, but there are a couple of ways in which multilateral financial institutions like the IFC or the Asian Development Bank or people like that can help a master developer and a community build out new cities. Of course, one is just to lend directly to the government, but that's less likely to happen if there isn't the competence and the capability we talked about before. So if you imagine a master developer with that competence and capability, what's the advantage of having a multilateral? And there are a couple advantages around sort of tactical things like policies, and particularly the policy uncertainty I mentioned before. It's much less likely that a local government or national government will treat the World Bank badly on a credit question or dispute, so that the private capital is happy to be with them. There's also an ability to help in the phasing of the project. So if you think about a large infrastructure project, there's an inception period for a subway or a dam that can be years and years and years. Well, it's approvals and engineering, and the project might never even happen. So it's very expensive and very risky. So the multilaterals can help a lot with that phase. Almost no private capital wants to take that kind of risk. Then second, there's the construction phase risk between financial close and construction close. But then there's the long operating phase. And the way that the multilaterals invest now, they put the money up front, take all this risk, but essentially get the long-term kind of steady yield payback. That's a mismatch. So it seems to me, and to several others in this space, that the multilaterals ought to be deployed at the beginning in the risk phase, but they ought to structure their investment so it can become liquid, so it can be securitized or sold, which they don't think about doing. They should be able to sell that once the asset is stabilized to more institutional capital. So when people talk about the trillions of dollars in the global financial system that can come into this space, a lot of it is in pension funds and endowments, insurance companies. They don't have the capability to underwrite the quality of an investment in a dam, but they could buy a rated bond for a dam that was initially built by the IFC. So there are both sort of strategic ways that these entities can be involved to help reduce the risk, and there's some very clear financial structuring ways in which the security could be used to deploy the risk capital at the beginning from the multilaterals, have them exit, recycle the capital, and bring in the global capital for the long-term financing. So those are two frontiers that we see in that space. I think that's a relatively easy question, actually. There are two major things. One is just to be realistic. So there are lots and lots of city governments who think, oh, if we can get a big developer from New York or London or Japan or Singapore to come in here, they will create a city from whole cloth where there's currently nothing. Guess what? That does not happen. So that they can bring some realism. And the second is around the software. So a lot of what Singapore, of course, is famous for is the way the city operates and functions with transparency and accountability. And in some of the projects outside, like in Suzhou in China or Tianjin in China, the software, meaning the processes, the transparency, the accountability, the cleanliness of the project, the openness of the tender process for competitive vendors is all something that makes investors much more comfortable. So if a government is not willing to do that kind of foundational software for dynamic governance that recognizes competition on the merits and the value of enterprise, then it's very difficult for master developers to hold their nose, look the other way, and hope that they don't get besmirched. Broadly, I think this also is relatively simple. It's like many other investments in the built environment. There are 3 points of time to consider: getting in, operating, and getting out. So in terms of getting in, how do you get the capital in? What do you build? In terms of operating, what is the cash flow from the asset, either from the city or from the road or from the dam? And in the end, how do you exit and get out and not just own this asset forever? So if you think, even lay people who are uncomfortable with numbers can think, how do I get in? How do I operate? How do I get out? So the details in that are around a lot of the principles of finance, like how do you acquire the land? How do you think about the bulk infrastructure? How do you prepare the land? How do you do the amenities? Then how do you do real estate development? All those things have separate skills. They have separate time frames. And the ability to separate or keep distinct all those capabilities and not all those assets is a way to set things up where every entity takes a level of risk it's comfortable with at the point in time it's comfortable with, providing the kind of expertise that it has in a kind of a segmented way, rather than have a big amorphous entity trying to do all these different skill sets with multiple different time frames and multiple different paybacks. So the ability to split that up both by time and by role is a way to organize these things.